Hi everybody, thank you for joining today's webinar, Total Cost Visibility, the Key to Strategic Sourcing Success. My name is Joe Gehring and I will be your host today. So just a few housekeeping items. We will answer your questions at the end of the webinar. Go ahead and ask your questions by using the Q&A feature in the WebEx toolbar at the top of your screen. Click the Q&A button and type your question to the host only. You'll receive copies of the slides and a link to the recording after the event. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Michael Cross, PhD, is the Senior Manager of Solutions Marketing for DirectWorks. The research you'll see in today's presentation comes from his extensive training in research and analysis, coupled with more than 20 years of software experience. Greg Anderson is the President of DirectWorks. The insight he brings to today's webinar comes from 25 years of experience in manufacturing, enterprise software, strategic sourcing, and supply chain operations. And now I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Joe. Welcome, everyone. So today we have over 100 registrants. Many of you manufacturers, $500 billion in sales and up. Why the interest? Well, we run a monthly tracker that focuses on supply chain issues and needs. And in this tracker, supply chain and sourcing professionals consistently identify visibility into total cost as the #1 area in need of improvement. And many other consultants out there will confirm this as well. So let's start with the definition of total cost. We keep it very simple. It's the total economic cost to purchase, stock, and deliver the items you source to your manufacturing. And even though this is a very simple concept, it's a very critical concept, right, Greg?
That's right, Michael. Thank you. So why is it so important? The primary reason, it's pretty simple, total cost visibility. If you have that visibility into the different sourcing options available to you, you're able to make better sourcing decisions. Understanding total cost is essential as manufacturers continually seek to evolve and optimize their manufacturing operations footprint around the world. The second reason that total cost visibility is important, it enables you to negotiate pricing more effectively. By having visibility into the cost drivers of your suppliers, you can negotiate with them more effectively, and that results in higher profit margins. When you've got better sourcing decisions and higher profit margins, the people in sourcing have a happier life. But why is it such a challenge? What's holding people back from taking this approach to their sourcing? The first reason that we've heard is that there's a lot of pressure just towards choosing the lowest price versus the best total cost. That's a cultural shift that needs to happen. You need to say, hey, we're going to do a lot more work and look at a lot more factors to make our sourcing decisions. It's chess, it's not checkers. Second reason is people don't have a complete look at total cost. If they have a formula for total cost, maybe it's incomplete, so it doesn't enable them to make the best decisions. Third is your suppliers don't want you to take a total cost approach. They want to be vague. They want to be able to, hide profit in their pricing. Fourth reason, it's often difficult to find the information that you need to come up with a total cost picture, and it's hard to find that data in other systems that may belong in another function within your company. And the last reason, and this is significant, it's last but not least, is a lack of time. People say we don't have the time to do it right, we want to do it better. But when we take this total cost approach, it requires more information. And if you're managing information in big spreadsheets today, your spreadsheets are only going to get bigger when you start adding additional elements of cost. That leads to more cumbersome work and time-consuming work. So these are the challenges that we've heard out there as we talk to people about why they don't take a total cost approach. So what's the solution? And we use a simple framework here. Most every solution I've ever run into can be described in terms of people, process, and technology. We're going to touch on each of these today in this webinar, but we're going to have a special emphasis on process. That's where we're going to spend most of our time. And we're going to start, though, with people. When it comes to people, it starts with the culture in your company. To improve visibility into total cost, you need to establish the right culture to make sure you have the right people with the right capabilities. What do we mean by that? You got to say, hey, we're going to focus on total cost. We're not just going to go with the lowest price. That used to work about 10 years ago when you would source to emerging regions like China. Now you have to be a lot more careful. The labor arbitrage isn't there anymore. You could make the wrong decision, and by the time you land those parts in your supply chain into your manufacturing floor, they could cost more than if you'd have bought them domestically. So you have to change your culture from lowest price to the best total cost. The other thing that this requires is breaking down internal silos between groups within your company. You need to get finance involved. You'll see that they play a big part in this. You also need to get other stakeholders like engineering and quality involved in the process. The third point here is probably the most important one, and this really speaks to the kind of people you need. It's not just about computing costs, but also evaluating trade-offs. What do I mean by that? You have to evaluate risk. Is there supplier risk? Is there, location risk with where we're bringing these parts in from, whether that's political or if it's weather risk related to tsunamis. You say, do we want to have a supply chain that long? The other is quality risk, right? Are you willing to maybe just take a barely acceptable quality, or you want a higher quality part, and are you willing to pay for it? It's about getting the best value for your money. So you need people that can do the analysis and have the strong analytical skills to conduct the right analyses, as well as communicate why this supplier is a better choice and we're willing to pay a bit more for this supplier over that one. Lastly, total cost is going to give you a visibility into a lot of elements of cost that you can use very effectively when you're negotiating with suppliers. So you need to have people who have very strong negotiation capabilities.
All right, let's now look at the second part of the solution framework, and that's process. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time here today. And our process, our process is based on a 5-step framework, this white paper that we developed and released about a week ago. And I think I know most of you already have a copy of the white paper, and it's available on our website if you need to download yet another copy. But total cost visibility is the key to strategic sourcing success. We built this white paper based on our market research, interviews, and conversations that we've had with market leaders, many whom have mastered visibility into total cost or are on their way to mastering total cost. And visually, the way I like to describe the framework is a pyramid. And if you remember from your psychology days, self-actualization, there was this Maslow's self-actualization where you built your satisfaction over time based on different levels. Well, this is the sourcing actualization pyramid. And when you're building a pyramid, you got to get the first level right. Okay, it's got to be strong. It's going to have to support everything that comes after this. It's got to be level. It's got to be your best work. And it's the key to success with everything building upon it. So our cornerstone and ground floor of the pyramid is defining total cost and identifying the components. Then we're going to talk about developing a roadmap to collect cost information, creating a 2-step cost template for suppliers, overlaying internal costs, and finally, sourcing actualization occurs when you use all this information during the compare, negotiate, decide, and learning process. So let's start with defining cost and identifying components. Greg?
Thanks. Unlike Michael, I'm not qualified to speak about self-actualization and other matters of psychology, but fortunately I'm pretty good at math. So I'm good enough to spell out the equation for total cost that we have here, which we've prioritized based on the contribution of each element. So working your way from the top to the bottom of this list, component cost, transit cost, finance cost, you go from the biggest contributors to the smaller contributors to the total cost equation. So it's a good way to prioritize it. Some people may look at this and say, Anderson, you're crazy, you missed something here. Where is the switching cost associated with moving from one supplier to another? We left that out. We're going to acknowledge that we left that out because we're really looking at an ongoing cost of doing business with somebody. There is a one-time switching cost when you change suppliers, and that's something that you'll need to compute and take into account if you're contemplating moving your business from one supplier to another. So now we'll dig into each one of these factors, and we're going to give you some best practices along the way. First total cost factor, component cost. This is the single biggest driver of total cost, and you roll these up into what's called commonly the piece price of the item that you're buying. So here's a machine part that's got material in it. It's taken some labor to produce that, some production, maybe some heat treating, so there's energy costs. All the costs on down the line there that go into producing this part. This is what it takes for the supplier to produce the part, and they lay on top of that their profit. Okay, so that's what makes up the component costs. Some best practices here. If you get this breakdown from your suppliers, I said this before, I'll say it again, you're going to be in a better position to understand what the cost drivers are from a particular supplier for that part, and that will enable you to negotiate more effectively, especially if you're comparing several suppliers side by side. And if you have a should cost team at your company where you have should cost for this part, you can also compare their breakdown to that should cost breakdown and really find areas where maybe they've misquoted based on a lack of understanding, or if they're just trying to pad something in there. So it gives you, this visibility is really important, this breakdown is really important for negotiating. Another best practice, any commodity-driven price escalators or de-escalators have to be clearly spelled out. So let's say, for instance, you have copper in a part. You want to tie that to an index if you're going to say, all right, we're going to let that component of the cost go up and down with the copper index on the LME. That needs to be clearly spelled out when you're adding up your cost and working with the supplier to get that cost. And then the last is don't be afraid or don't hesitate to ask for profit margin. You want your suppliers to be profitable. We're not advocating putting your suppliers out of business. But this information is really important to give you a full picture of how they stack up against their competition. And you can potentially identify hidden profits that might be buried in some of the other component costs.
Thanks, Greg. We're going to take a break here to conduct our one and only poll for the day. And you will be seeing a poll pop up on your screen very shortly. It's going to ask you, are you asking suppliers for their profit margin today as part of the quoting process? It's a yes or no, and there you see it. And we're going to just give you about 10 more seconds. Are you asking suppliers for their profit margin today as part of the quoting process? Yes or no? Hit submit. We're going to give it another 5 seconds. And Joe, do you want to publish the results, please? So, we're publishing the results now. And you can see that it's about 2/3 to 1/3, Greg.
Yep.
With 2/3 not asking for profit margin. And indeed, that's something that we're seeing in the marketplace. And the best practice is to learn how to ask for profit margin in the right way. Now, I mean, there's obviously a right way of asking and a wrong way of asking. So, not enough people are asking, and probably even fewer are asking for it in the right way. And it's something, maybe you can talk with others who do that, learn that practice a little bit better.
Yeah. All right, great. We'll move on now to the next element of the total cost equation.
Okay. Pardon us for a second. There we go.
All right. Second leading contributor to the total cost is transit costs. And these are costs, quite simply, these are the costs you incur in moving the parts from the supplier's shop, their manufacturing location where they produce the parts, to your manufacturing sites. Many factors to consider here, and some will apply to only certain suppliers. For example, if you're manufacturing in Mexico and you source your parts from a local supplier, you will not have to worry about the elements of cost known as customs, duties, and tariffs, right? You're not importing anything, you're getting it in-country. However, if you do source some of your parts from China, those duties and tariffs and customs are going to come into play. So you need to understand for which suppliers, are these costs going to be applicable. Some best practices here is to make sure you clearly define the Incoterms which are the international commercial terms, that communicate the tasks, costs, and risks associated with transporting and delivering the parts. Basically, who's responsible for what at what point in the process, who's paying for it, who's responsible for the risk insurance, et cetera, and so on. Make sure you have that clear and that you're comparing the quotes in a sort of an apples-to-apples way. You also should evaluate the cost of arranging transit through your own network of carriers. Chances are your company's buying power is far greater than that of a supplier, and you can secure much better transit rates. So if you can arrange for your own delivery through your own carriers, you'll often get a lower total cost. Additional piece of advice here, when you're thinking about transit, it's more along the risk side, but you really have to develop risk and scenario plans for each option that you look at. So if you're shipping, for instance, into the Port of Long Beach and they go on strike, how easy is it for you, or do you have a contingency plan where you can reroute that shipment to go in through the Port of Oakland and still get your parts to the West Coast in the time that you need to keep your manufacturing operation running?
And Greg, one of the things I found fascinating about scenario planning is that it has been proven if you do scenario planning in advance and you do indeed have to invoke a scenario, it will be cheaper than if you try to come up with a scenario, let's say within 30 days or 60 days. So scenario planning really can pay off because you understand you can control the factors you want to control.
Great. Okay. Next element of cost, we're right in the middle here. We've talked about components and transit. Now we're going to talk about a really exciting topic, the finance costs, okay? These costs are generally calculated internally, but you will use information from suppliers to calculate them often. Finance costs address the differences in payment terms, exchange rates, and especially lead times. And I'm going to zero in on lead times. That's a real driver of cost when you consider inventory. So the longer the supplier's lead time, the more inventory you will have to have in your system. That is not a guess, that is a certainty. So when you're looking at, gee, I have to carry a lot more inventory to cover this overseas supply chain than I would a domestic supply chain, you really have to understand what's the weighted average cost of capital and what's the annual charge I'm going to incur on carrying inventory to store it, heat it, move it around, pack it, unpack it. All of that has to come into account. So there's a lot of good discipline now in sophisticated supply chain organizations at manufacturers, and those people can help you, the people in logistics and transportation can help you come up with some of these costs and understand that cost better. Which leads to the best practices. Involve finance early. Here we go again. But you really need to get the information, you need to complete your total cost picture. And I like to say you have to help them help you by giving them the information they need to come up with the finance portion of the total cost equation. More sophisticated sourcing organizations that we talk to have access or even have financial analysts on their team to help them look at the different scenarios and impacts of sourcing maybe domestically versus international, and understanding what these finance costs are. Overall, you come up with a better picture of the cost when you take into account these factors.
Greg, I've talked with a number of people out there who just really believe in the finance cost piece. In fact, they see it as the secret sauce. Getting this part wrong could lead to the wrong sourcing decision. A lot of people ignore it, figure it all evens out in the end. It doesn't. It can change the right supplier from A to B. You really need someone to help you finance costs.
Okay, now we're down to the fourth element, which we call compliance costs. Compliance costs, they include things like regulatory reporting requirements. Sorry there, I'm not good with assonance. Legal costs, and sometimes fines or other costs associated really with a supplier's failure to adhere to certain regulations, standards, or codes of conduct that you have. A couple key compliance areas include corporate social responsibility, diversity, business operations. Hey, do they have the right insurance certificates? Are their licenses up to date? That takes a lot of administrative work to manage. And these costs are generally fairly close from supplier to supplier, right? You have to administer one, you have to administer both of them. But when you look at suppliers maybe in emerging regions, and they're that much further away or that much harder to get to, or they work in a different culture, sometimes it's more expensive to monitor them for compliance. So you have to bear that in mind. As far as best practices here, we really suggest you just look at how the expected compliance costs would vary between the different suppliers. Are you going to need more reporting? Does that lead to higher administrative costs? Does one supplier make you not feel so good when you look at maybe their the labor that they're using to produce the parts, right? These are important things to consider, and you have to weigh that in, and maybe you want to handicap them a bit by giving them a higher compliance component of cost when you're putting together the total picture, because there is some risk there. Finally, the fifth portion of the total cost equation here is the cost of poor quality. And this is basically when a supplier or their parts fail to meet your specified quality standards. There's a lot of hidden costs here, as you see in this little iceberg graphic that we have here, and these have to all be sort of considered when you're putting together your total cost picture. Best practices here. If you're working with current suppliers, chances are you've got some pretty good quality data and you've got a good sense of their cost of poor quality. For new suppliers, you can make estimates based on other suppliers as a proxy, or maybe your quality team has done some diligence on this particular supplier, done site visits, maybe audited some of their parts, or you have representative quality data that they've provided to you. You can factor that into what's our expected cost of poor quality with the supplier. And make sure your definition, the second point here, of defects and cost of poor quality includes all sorts of defects, not just in the parts themselves, but they may have a delivery defect. If they're late, 30% of the time, and you're paying expediting fees, that's a cost, right? That's an issue. That might shut down your production lines. You have to weigh that in as well. It's also important to assess, what a supplier's failure to produce quality could do to your top line. What do I mean by that? So if you have some parts that are bad and you have a lot of failures out in the field, that can hurt your reputation, that can lead to recalls and warranties, that can lead to other field problems and have a really devastating impact on your revenues. So you really have to choose carefully who you do business with and make sure that their quality is at the very least acceptable. In some cases, for critical parts, it may be worth it to pay a little bit more for a higher level of quality.
All right. Let's go through a couple of examples just to make sure people understand that you're not just computing the cost, but you're going to use it in your decision-making process. So this is an oversimplified example. Let's suppose you're a manufacturer and you have a plant in the Chicagoland area, and you're trying to make a final decision on some machine parts between two suppliers. Supplier A from Toledo, Ohio. All right, we love Toledo, Ohio. It's one of the great cities of the United States. Supplier B is from China. And so you look at the component cost, and not surprisingly, the Chinese come in about 16 cents less per item. Because of the labor costs, a few other things, Toledo is much higher. And you're also not surprised by the fact that you can move parts from Toledo to Chicago much easier than you can move them from China to Chicago. So the transit costs have a expected difference. The real driver decision here, however, is the finance cost. And it has to do with lead times, it has to do with payment terms, it has to do with the strength of the dollar versus the yen. And the finance cost here is 6 cents per item in favor of supplier A. When you add them all up, there's a little bit of a increase to China for compliance and cost of poor quality. You can clearly see that Toledo would be a better choice as a total cost provider as opposed to the piece price where they're 16% higher. But just doing the simple math is the easy part of the process. In example 2 here, you have to realize you have to take into consideration all these trade-offs. So here we have 3 suppliers, Alpha Company, Beta Company, Zeta Company. They come in with piece price bid of $195 for Zeta, $215 for Alpha, $225 for Beta. So if you were just making your decision based on total cost, you'd go with Zeta. But it's not just about total cost. There's trade-offs. Quality here is the same. If it was different, that would come into play. Well, how about capacity? Zeta is kind of running out of capacity. The top there may be 3 or 4 key manufacturers using them, and they can't guarantee that your parts are going to arrive on time. Also, they've had some market issues lately, and all of a sudden their credit score has been downgraded. And maybe most importantly, their pricing is linked to a commodity index, and there's no controls over, there's no protection for you. If that commodity sails up, you're going to pay that extra price. Alpha, meanwhile, they have a different profile, and even Beta, even they're higher, they have an even different profile. Well, what would you say if you had a target price of $230? Well, you'd feel good about even choosing Beta Company, Greg, because they're under the target price, and you'd be controlling for all the risk factors. But we know life's not that easy. It never comes in like that. Often the case is your target cost is $2.10, and then you need to decide who to use. Do I go with the lowest price and take on all this risk? Do I go for Alpha Company, which is just 5 cents more, and mitigate a lot of the risk? What do I do? Having all this information available to all the parties helps you make the best sourcing decision. So, we're halfway through our webinar. We spent 50% of our time on level 1, the ground floor, the building block, the cornerstone. You got to get it right. Now let's quickly go through the other 4 stages and build upon what we've learned here so that we can really master total cost. Greg?
Okay, so the next step is to really develop a roadmap. Once you know that what data is required to build out your total cost model, now you've got to go out and figure out where you're going to get that information. So you got to map it to the appropriate sources. Some of the data is going to come from suppliers. Some will come from your internal systems, let's say your transportation system, for instance. The finance department will help you with those inventory costs. And you may even have information from should cost models if you have got a discipline around that where you want to use that should cost to compare it to the pricing that you're getting. You really need to have a coordinated effort here with a cross-functional team. Get finance, get the transportation people involved, figure out who's going to provide what data. Because it doesn't all just come from the suppliers. You've got to have your own internal costs to put in there as well. Best practice here is to do it in phases, right, and prioritize. Start with a smaller data set. Prioritize it by the biggest drivers of cost, right? Try to get those component costs and transit costs, for instance. And then start to add incremental data over time and refine your model. Your model's going to change a bit over time, and you can keep making it better and better by each commodity. Often our customers have these templates built by commodities, and that's a great best practice as well. So now we're moving up that pyramid pretty quickly here, and the next step is to create a 2-step cost template for suppliers. What are we talking about here? If there's any advice we can give you about total cost, this is one of the best in terms of having a good relationship with your suppliers and getting them to buy into this type of a quoting methodology. It's based on direct experience working with our customers, and when we set up our customers with total cost templates in our software, we always talk about this approach. We advocate going out with a first round quote with a minimal amount of information, basically a qualifying round, if you will, to assess their supplier's relative competitiveness. If they're not competitive on the piece price, those component costs, chances are it's not going to be a much better story when you start adding in all the other factors of total cost. So do a first round, assess their competitiveness, and then down select them and move to the next round where you can gather more detailed information. A couple reasons why that works. One, to make it work effectively, you got to communicate openly with suppliers. Here's how we're going to go through this. Round 1, some basic information. In round 2, we're going to ask for more stuff. We need more information to make our decision. But they know by making it to round 2, they're still in the game. And they'll be much more likely to fill out a more detailed total cost template than if they just get a blind RFP in round 1 that's super detailed. Offer the suppliers something in return. They're putting work into this. And if they don't make it, or if they do make it, let them know where they stand. They want to know how competitive they are. Give them some of that visibility back. Say, look, I don't know what's wrong, but your labor costs are a lot higher than anybody else that's out there. You're producing in the same region. I just don't understand it, but that's something you need to look at and work on. They want that feedback. It's valuable to them. And the third point here is really look into automating the quoting and analysis to streamline the process here. You are working through a lot of data. You may be doing multiple rounds here, and you need a quick way to gather that information and analyze that information, make sense of it in a quick way. And we'll get more into that as we move toward technology. Okay, step number 4 is to overlay the internal costs. These are costs that you calculate internally. Typically your finance costs, compliance costs, cost of poor quality. This information, some of it can be calculated in advance, but often you have to wait until you get the information from the suppliers, such as lead time, to really calculate this cost and nail it. At this point, you also need to be beyond just looking at the lead time impact and other finance costs. Here's where you want to start looking at any quality differences and compliance concerns and starting to add that into the equation. Typically, as I said before, the component costs and the transit costs are the biggest driver of costs, but don't underestimate finance. As Michael said, it could be a make or break, and the compliance and quality costs also speak a lot more to the risk associated with working with the supplier.
All right, let's look at the final stage, sourcing actualization, step 5. This is a step where you want to compare your bids, negotiate with suppliers, make a final decision, and learn and feedback what you've learned to all the parties involved. And think about, this is the step where over time you're mastering understanding what's going on in the marketplace. Think about how powerful it's going to be if you, even as you were going through the bidding process, could look at all your suppliers and already understand what's going to drive the cost differences among them. And you're looking for exceptions to the way you're thinking about things. Places they may be padding the bid, trying to get an advantage. When you understand your supplier as much as they understand them, you can develop winning negotiation strategies. You can help play the strengths of one against the weaknesses of the other, line by line, until you really get the best total cost. And you also have to remember that you have to compare what you've negotiated to reality, all right? What is your identified cost versus realized cost? Go back and make sure that nothing is slipping into the final bill that is driving up the cost, or that the finance cost model has a mistake in it, something that needs to be adjusted for. Some best practices: conduct a systematic supplier-by-supplier negotiation. Give them all the feedback they want, as Greg said, but go line by line. Hey, your tooling costs are way out of line here. I need you to get that in line, or else it's really going to hurt your bid. Automate the analysis process. You can't be juggling spreadsheets here. You need to have your suppliers inputting this data into your sourcing tools so that you can be monitoring the results as we go along. And then share what you've learned with all key parties to continuously improve the cost knowledge, even going back to update your should cost and target cost models.
All right, thanks, Michael. Michael gets to take the top of the pyramid, it figures. He came up with it, so I had to give him that top layer. All right, we're going to move into technology now, the third part of the solution, okay? And there's a few things that we know that are truths. Total cost visibility requires the acquisition and analysis of more data. You've got to look at more factors and come up with a bigger equation, if you will, to look at total cost. We also know that adding more data to a big spreadsheet will only make the spreadsheet bigger. It increases the time that it takes to analyze that information and make sense of it all and come up with a better decision. There is technology, there is software that you can use, not spreadsheets, to enable and streamline your sourcing process. The software allows you to collect and analyze data in more data in less time. Enabling your sourcing process with software, we've seen it where it can reduce sourcing cycle times, not measured by us, but measured by a customer, by 50%. Their time to quote a part was reduced by 50%. Just think what you can do with 50% more time. The other important part about technology versus spreadsheets is that you've got all this critical sourcing data, and now it's all stored in an enterprise system where you can make use of it and analyze it and understand it and house it and have visibility into it versus having it in a bunch of inboxes and hard drives scattered all over your organization. Email is not an enterprise system. That's not going to work for you. So where you kind of want to move from is this, right? In this picture, I'm sure this hurts, but it's the painful reality for many people that are on this call right now. There's massive spreadsheets, and there's lots of them. And many manufacturers we talk to, they say, we have an e-sourcing system. But when you look at the technology, it's really built for sourcing indirect goods and services. Most e-sourcing technology is built for that because they sell the whole market. What's common among the whole market? Indirect. Everybody buys indirect. Doesn't matter what business you're in. It's great for sourcing office supplies. It's great for sourcing professional services, but it really doesn't do the trick for direct materials. As a consequence, when we go in and we talk to people who are sourcing direct materials, they're doing it one of two ways. They either send out spreadsheets via email, their total cost spreadsheets, which are really great and really detailed, but they send them out via email, or they take them and they attach them in a project in this e-sourcing tool, and then they basically use the e-sourcing tool as a glorified email system to distribute their spreadsheets and get them back. At the end of the day, the result's the same. You still get back a bunch of spreadsheets that you've got to make sense of, chase down missing data, and put that analysis together, and it takes sometimes days to put together the picture you're trying to put together. So there, I've revealed the pain. But you can move to this, right? This is direct material sourcing streamlined. An enterprise system, you got the key data that's been put in by suppliers. It's all served up to you in a nice side-by-side comparison, and you get that visibility into total cost. All the data collection and analysis is automated. It's basically taking the lean principles that all manufacturers have applied to their shop floor and applying it to your business process. What do I mean by that? We're taking waste out through automation. You waste a lot of time with spreadsheets and that analysis. You don't have to. So now, when you look at something like this, you've got the fact base in front of you, all those elements of total cost and a real good understanding, and you can go to the suppliers and effectively negotiate and make the best sourcing decisions. This is how you do direct material sourcing with DirectWorks. So, to wrap things up before we go into Q&A, and summarize, improving total cost visibility results in better sourcing decisions and higher profit margins. Having that kind of visibility allows you to negotiate more effectively, drive better pricing, and make better decisions as to who you're going to do business with. You can achieve total cost visibility and improve sourcing productivity at the same time. That seems to be a conflict there. Gee, I need more information to improve my total cost visibility. If I get more information, it's going to be more work. It doesn't have to be more work. You've got to get away from the spreadsheets. You've got to streamline your sourcing operation. How do you do that? You don't just do it with technology. You've got to have capable people, the right people on your team. You've got to have a proven process and a good model for how you're going to look at total cost for each commodity. And you've got to have the right technology to enable that. So that ends it. I believe our next segment is the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael and Greg. Before we get into the Q&A, let me answer what I know is the number one question. Yes, the slides and recording will be sent to all the attendees today. As a final reminder, ask your questions by using the Q&A feature in the WebEx toolbar at the top of your screen. Click the Q&A button and type your question to the host only. So we did have a few come in. Let's start with this one. We don't have the time to get all 5 components of total cost. How should we prioritize? Should we just use the top 3?
That's a great place to start. So I'd work my way from the top down. Certainly you want to look at component costs so you understand what's driving the cost for your suppliers. It allows you to negotiate a lot more effectively. Transit costs are super important when you're trying to say, where do I put my suppliers and my sources for the parts? Maybe I'm setting up shop in China, and it makes a lot more sense to source locally than it does to bring it in from another region. So certainly components and transit costs are important. Finance costs, if you get the right people working with you, go after those. But yeah, start with the top 3 and then work your way down to the next 2. As we said, do it in phases over time. It'll drive you crazy if you try to get it right on the first attempt, but keep working it.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. The next question, is your software as a service?
Yeah, DirectWorks is delivered as a service, so it's real easy to get up and running. It's very low cost of ownership associated with it, like all SaaS products, and we find it's a very effective means, and our customers love the fact that we can get them up and running in about a month.
Great, thank you. Another great question here. Greg, could you provide an example of the correct and incorrect way to ask a supplier for their profit margin?
I should make Michael answer this question, but I'll answer it. I think it comes down to communication and really saying, why do you need to know that information? And say, look, this is how we're doing business. And we have customers who do this. They say, look, if you want to work with us, we need to have this sort of visibility into costs. We want you to make money. We want you to make a profit, but we want to make sure that, we're paying the most competitive price that we can get for the parts that we're putting into our equipment. Everybody understands business. Everybody understands the logic of profit margins. And everybody knows that you can't work with people and put them out of business doing so. That's a bad end game. So I think you need to go to them and explain why you want to get that information and, without being too evasive. And, at the end of the day, they can shuffle their costs between the components and into profit. They can make their profit look smaller and their component costs be higher, but that's why you need that sort of visibility to find out if you're getting an honest deal from them. I know it's not easy to do, but we've seen it done successfully at a number of customers, and it requires a mindset change. But that's where the world's going today. It's a much more transparent world, and people need to know this information.
Yeah, and that's why when we started off with people, it's this type of conversation your people need to be skilled at, not managing spreadsheets. They can't be just good at math. They have to be good at having conversations. So it's not so much even how you ask, but it's the conversation you're going to have. And going back to my last point about sourcing actualization, so if you compare similar suppliers, you basically want to say, hey, I'm trying to understand why you're 10% higher. So help me understand, is it just your labor cost is different than a similar provider in the same reasons labor cost? Or do you need a higher profit margin to really survive? Because I'm going to have to take that back to my management and say, look, this company's willing to work for a lower profit margin. This one needs to hold their profit margin. So it's about the conversation and really doing business together and moving down that partnership path. I would say the wrong way to do it was just to put it in the bid and never talk to them about it. That's the wrong way of doing it.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen. So speaking of people and changing mindsets, the next question is, how do you change the company culture from lowest price to total cost?
Well, I think, we work with customers, and often they realize that they have the ability now to get to total cost, and there's change management involved with anything that you're doing, especially when you're implementing software like ours, and we want to make sure our customers are successful. And we often show them, okay, you might want to start out here with a total cost template that's not so complex, but start to condition your suppliers to see things this new way. And then as far as the culture goes within the company, you just have to sit back and say, hey, look, the world is changing. The fact that we were trying to put, it was a no-brainer to put some parts into China if they were smaller than a bread box in the last decade, that's different now. And you need to look at that labor arbitrage isn't there. And often you go to the finance people and they say, yeah, sourcing, you say you saved us all this money, but I don't see it in the P&L. Where's it going? Well, you'll find out that it's going to higher inventory carrying costs, or it's going to higher transportation costs, or higher expediting costs, or higher damage costs associated with bad quality or bad shipping. So you really need to take a top-down and a bottoms-up sort of look at things and get your management aligned, along with finance, around, hey, this is a better way to do this, and we need to start looking at it differently. And we have the capability to do it now without hiring an army of people to do it. There's more productivity out there than ever before, and you can get to it now.
Thank you, Greg. That was helpful. Next question. What do you do when you have a critical supplier that is hesitant to expose their costs when you don't have a good alternative source of parts?
Well, you may have to just live with them. In some cases, if you've got yourself boxed in where you've only got one supplier who can provide something, the first thing I would advise working on is finding a way to mitigate that risk. And you've got to find an alternative source of supply. What if something goes wrong with that supplier and all your eggs are in one basket? So having a dual sourcing supplier strategy, or having a supplier development group that's working on developing alternative suppliers. We see this time and time again with direct materials, where engineering has been driving the product launch and sourcing hasn't been involved until very late, and they're locked into one supplier because he's the only person that can produce that part to the spec that they need. And now you're pretty much, they got you over a barrel. So I would work on finding alternative suppliers there and saying, hey, we got to keep you competitive as well. We like doing business with you. We like our relationship, but we got to understand if we're overpaying you, that's just not good business for us.
That was an interesting twist on the question we usually get, which is, what happens if my supplier objects to filling out this detail? Well, we've seen some of our clients, some of the most senior directors of supply chain, well known in the industry, gather their commodity buyers, gather their commodity managers and staff and say, this is what you tell them. You have to do it. It's the way we do business. Now, obviously, you need choices to make, to change from supplier A to supplier B. But the bottom line is, people will test you. They will push back on providing all this detail. And you just got to draw a line in the sand and say, this is the way we do business.
Thank you. Next question. Why would we bother calculating total cost for 5-cent nuts and bolts?
All right. I'll take that one. The question is, or rather, the answer is, well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. It comes down to how much money you're spending on nuts and bolts, and how big the savings could be, and how granular the bidding could be. All right, if you truly can go through a total cost process and shave off tenths of a cent, deciding between China or Mexico or Toledo, you may take something that small through the total cost process if indeed you're talking millions and millions of dollars here. But like everything else, you're going to make a decision up front which projects go through the strategic sourcing process.
Thanks, Michael. Last question, which I think we hear a lot here at DirectWorks, is we may be willing to move off spreadsheet and use an online sourcing tool, but we may get some resistance from our suppliers. What do you do about them? Can they still use Excel for their quoting?
Yes. So our software, I'm going to speak specifically to our software. I can't speak for all e-sourcing software, but we do have the ability to. So we take a spreadsheet, we create a total cost template in our software based on your spreadsheet, make sure it all works, and you're gathering the information you need. And then suppliers are able to take that total cost template and export it into Excel. We understand that that's still a world a lot of people work in. At a supplier, you may have many people contributing to the roll-up of cost, and you might have somebody that works on the tooling portion of it, somebody that works on the material portion, the transformation portion of it. There's a lot of people working on putting together the cost of the supplier. They are able to download that into Excel and then upload it into our solution. There is a validation step that takes place to make sure that they've completed all the proper fields, or it won't be uploaded and it'll get kicked back to them. So we do provide a means for that, but all the analysis that goes on comes in automatically. When a supplier uploads their quote, it gets uploaded in a side-by-side comparison and a view that you've defined in the software so that you have the key info in front of you, the right fact base in front of you, and you can start to negotiate or start to make decisions on who you want to source with.
Thank you, Greg. So we're just about out of time. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. If you would, please complete the exit poll when you close WebEx and give us your honest feedback. And watch for copies of the slides and a link to the webinar recording in your inbox within 48 hours. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Have a great afternoon, and if there's any other questions, send them to us. And we know there are still few questions in the queue. We will get back to you after the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.